Hey Matt,
Hello there.
how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm great. Super pumped to chat. Thanks for doing this.
My pleasure.
An athlete actually handed me this book in the bike shop probably in 2018. He's like, "You got to read this thing." And I was like, it was awesome. And there's actually a couple things I think back to, and it's on my list to reread. So I'm gonna, if anyone is listening and has not read How Bad Do You Want It, I highly recommend it as an athlete myself. It's just, yeah, there's a lot that rang true. And I stumbled across your website and I was like, man, I recognize that name from somewhere. What is that? And then
Mhm.
I obviously went through and realized you had written a whole slew of books.
Yep.
And yeah, so it's great to connect. I just love talking to other coaches. And I think you'll have interesting insights kind of from your background is really, you kind of, I was reading, I forget on what website, like you kind of started as a journalist as a kid and then got into coaching later, right? Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, my first, paid journalism work, I was still in high school. Just, as a kind of a sports stringer for a local newspaper. I had no idea at the time that it would evolve to where I am today. But yeah, I started young.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So I think I'll post the link to your website 80/20, which the name, a lot of people will probably immediately have a guess as to what that means. But really, from watching some of your videos, how most athletes do well from 80% lower intensity, 20% higher intensity. So I thought we could maybe start the conversation there. There was always a bunch of questions kind of on what I would say are basic, but really aren't. Kind of talking about heart rate versus power, and I'm just curious where you fall in that, in which camp. So if that sounds good to you, we'll kind of kick it off with that.
Sure thing. Yes. So it's funny, this zone two training is having a moment right now. It's like
Yes.
everybody's talking about it. It's just kind of funny. It's like as if you've been wearing some kind of odd type of clothing for years and years and years, and then suddenly it becomes fashionable and everyone's wearing it. It's like, well, where were you all?
Did you
um,
hear the latest with Andy Coggan on Inside Exercise?
no.
It's worth listening to just because he has when you say the zone two is having its moment, I think of like Inigo San Milan pumping this big time, guys
Yeah.
like Alan Cousins, and Andy has an interesting view. He's not fully in the same message as them, but it's interesting to hear now more people are kind of coming out, and it's so interesting that just this endurance zone two has started all
Yeah.
these conversations now. And so that's
Yeah.
a great point. That's kind of something that I would say is basic, but it's really not. I think people disagree on how hard endurance should be and how often it
Yeah.
should be. So maybe that's a good kind of a good first question when we're talking about the 80% and going easier. Are you focused on heart rate or power for zone two? Or you've also talked in the book about RPE.
Yeah.
And so how would you coach people to incorporate that feel along with whatever other metrics you want them to focus on?
Yeah, that is a good question. I wrote a blog post not too long ago for my 80/20 endurance blog about it was just exploring the question of what even is intensity? Like what are we talking about? Like we throw around that word as if like we're all referring to exactly the same thing as something very definite. And that's not really the case. It's actually more of a construct than it is an underlying, you know, cohesive, singular reality. And the post was inspired by a study that was done recently where intensity was measured in a variety of different ways. So there was a particular exercise protocol, and they measured intensity every way you could possibly measure it. And depending on whether you looked at like power or ventilation or blood lactate level or heart rate or RPE, the athletes were either exercising at a steady intensity, at an increasing intensity, or a decreasing intensity, the same exercise session. So all of these different ways of measuring intensity disagreed about what was actually happening. Not just with like not two different ways of measuring the same thing, but complete disagreement. Like, oh no, the athlete was working harder at the end. Oh
That
no,
is
the athlete was working.
interesting.
So that's pretty revealing right there. And if you sort of recognize the significance of that, it gets you like sort of prescribing intensity in a slightly different way.
And so, not to throw this down a wormhole, but I loved how I can't remember if it's a chapter or a section in the book where you say there's how you feel and then how you feel about how you feel.
Right.
And that changes everything. So, like, that could really
yes.
make the intensity spiral go like a
Yes.
number of ways based on day-to-day performance, which is
Yep.
another.
Yep.
So okay. So keep going with that thought.
Yeah. So the idea is that it's helpful to be aware of that. So you have a certain intention, right? Which is, for most of the time, it's to ensure the athlete is not going harder than they should. If we're talking about zone 2 training, no one ever goes too easy. That's just not a thing. if you're an athlete, if you're a competitive athlete, so you're just trying to make sure they're not, crossing that threshold. And then it just becomes a question of like, well, how do you keep them below it? Well, there's pros and cons to different metrics. It's like, it's that old adage of the blind men and the elephant. Like, depending on which part of the elephant you got your hand on, you describe it completely differently. And that's what intensity is doing. So it's just like, if you're going to commit to one, all right, we're all in for heart rate. Well, just understand the pros and cons, because it's all the data is the data, but it has to be interpreted before you can use it prescriptively. Then you can talk about rabbit holes, get into the specifics, the specific pros and cons of each. But that's generally how I look at it. It's like, I coach athletes who have different preferences. I seldom mess with their preferences, because I can typically, work with whatever they do prefer.
So you'll ask them, do you want to use heart rate? Do you have a power meter? Do you go by RPE and just see whatever they're okay? If you had to choose, how would you, if someone was like, well, you tell me.
Yeah. If it's a cyclist and it's like, okay, you can only take one intensity metric to the proverbial desert island, I would choose power for them. For a runner, and I coach mostly runners. Power is great, but power is newish. And so, and the thing about power is, you don't race by power. You don't win awards, for the best power output. And so I think pace always has to be. Got to use pace because you're racing on the clock. But with a lot of runners, I'm happy to have them use pace and power. Often I will suggest, especially like if an athlete is struggling with workout execution in a particular way, I will often say, hey, have you ever considered getting a power meter? And so occasionally do talk runners into getting a power meter.
Awesome. Do you look at, so with people using, I guess, maybe heart rate, or maybe there's another, I'm not familiar with pace since I don't coach any runners, but like there's some people that focus a lot on heart rate decoupling or these heart rate metrics. And then there's other people that are sort of like, after 2 or 3 hours of exercise, you're going to see decoupling. It's not that big of a deal. Where in the running world does that sort of come into play? And is it something that you try to look at all?
Yep. Good question. For me, I tend to focus on heart rate data in a sort of secondary way when I'm trying to understand the why of something that happened. Like if you take a runner who who really just trains entirely by pace, which is very doable. I mean, it used to be the only thing, for the longest time, and so that can usually work well. But if something leaves us scratching our heads, that's when I'll really focus on heart rate, and then that can start to fill in the picture a little bit and help us explain why the thing we observed happened and maybe what we can do about it.
Okay. So with pace, does someone get an exact number, or is it a range that they go for? And the reason I ask this is, for some reason, we've received the question so much in the past couple of years for cyclists, should I ride it high zone 2 or low zone 2? And it's funny because now all the zone 2 is coming back. And I think it depends. In the running world, how, as similar to what you're saying, no one goes too easy. That's why we try to tend to shift people, like, don't try to peg the highest number. Like, that's the top of the range. Is that similar with pace? Do you have runners always just trying to go the fastest pace? And how do you gauge that if that's a thing?
Yes. So if you look at the zone 2 stuff in particular, my philosophy on that, and I'm actually looking forward to, in another life, I need to be a sports scientist, because there's all these studies I want to see done that haven't been done yet, and I certainly don't have the competency to do. But my philosophy on the zone 2 stuff is, it's a tremendous, because it's 80% of your training, give or take. It's a tremendous opportunity to fine tune your workload. Because when you create a plan, it's a lot of educated guesses, right? You're trying to predict the future. Like, well, here's the workout I think will be appropriate for this athlete, 5 weeks from now. And that may not be the case, but like you need to plan. And then once you've created a plan, you hope to not have to make major adjustments to it, right? And so to the extent, but you always have to make some adjustments to it, because no coach has a crystal ball. So it's best to make small adjustments on the fly as you go, because if you do that skillfully, it can prevent you from having to make like bigger emergency adjustments. And your zone 2 training is the perfect opportunity for that. So, what I think is the best way to approach those sessions is know the range, and it should be a range, and then go by feel. And I think if you're doing it right, your zone 2 power should be wildly erratic from one session to it should be all over the place, because when you're carrying more fatigue or you just feel flat for unknown reasons, I mean, the body's complex, man. But some days you're just like, I don't know. And I think you should go with it on those days. And other days it's like you feel like you're on EPO, and it's like, man, it's like I'm having a hard time holding myself back here. But I think you should go with that too. And you're sort of like, you're just fine tuning your workload a little bit every day, in each one of those sessions. And I think it just kind of helps to keep you on track, overall in your training.
I love to hear that. And there's just this week, two newer, one guy's not newer, but one is definitely newer. And I was applauding him because he said, hey man, I think I need another rest day today. And I was like, that's amazing. Excuse me. The number of people that will just grind through and grit their teeth and he was, we were at the end of the block and it made sense. And then on the opposite side, this guy he almost set a PR and he's like, man, I just kind of held back. I just didn't go for it. I'm like, that's the day to go for it. Like you felt amazing. It's impossible for me to predict, like, this is when you're going to set this 10-minute PR today. Go for it. So it's interesting to hear that and just how athletes can interpret that. And so, it's getting more in tune with your own RP. It's so helpful. And it's awesome to hear that. Let's talk about the 20 then. So how do you decide what types of what is the 20 for you guys? And maybe in cycling terms, whether it's VO2 max, high threshold, anaerobic stuff, like where does all the people hear high intensity and they just want to go buck wild? There's definitely nuances to that. So maybe just open it up with that. What is the 20?
Yep. Exercise scientists are pretty much all speaking the same language on this at this point. So they have 3 buckets: low intensity, moderate, and high. So, low intensity is going to top out around the first ventilatory threshold. Moderate is going to top. And so for now, forgive me for speaking in running terms, but that's like,
okay. No, it translates. There's a lot of running in the book, and it actually, I'm like, man, maybe I need to pick up some shoes and go running.
So, it's something that like an average trained, like someone who's, just good enough to qualify for the Boston Marathon or something, they could sustain that, for, 4 hours, something like that, multi-hour. So that's the borderline between low and moderate. And then the borderline between moderate and high would be, the the second ventilatory threshold. There's a lot of things that happen around there. Critical power is right around there. But that's the highest intensity at which your body is able to maintain a fairly stable biochemical milieu. And then like once you go over that, then you're really at high intensity. And this isn't God's opinion. It's just scientists saying, it just sort of makes sense, to put the borderline here. And it really does make sense because at the VT1, if you go just over it, there's a sudden spike in the motor centers of your brain. Like your nervous system is like very abruptly having to work harder. And so it's a true physiological threshold and an impactful one, because like, you're engaging more type 2 muscle fibers then, and so it takes longer to recover. So that makes a lot of sense. The second, that border between moderate and high makes a lot of sense, because you sort of like, if you look at anyone's power curve, and it's like usually kind of nice and smooth, like where do they kind of go off a cliff a little bit? It's there, because again, like it's either like, like a sustainable internal state, or it's not. It's kind of binary, and I'm exaggerating a bit, but so that's a true threshold too. So those are obviously those are pretty big buckets, and there's a lot. You can slice it up even thinner than that. But for sure, like any endurance athlete needs to spend time, getting back to your question, the 20 is moderate and high, and you need to spend time in both. And, just to get one step further in the weeds, like I would say you should be spending, emphasizing moderate versus high or high versus moderate differently at different points in the training cycle. So it's like not always the same. It's like, it's like 10%, 10% always. Not necessarily. And also it depends on your specialization. If you're a sprinter, you're going to do more of the 20 is going to be at high intensity. If you're an ultra endurance guy or gal, you're going to be spending necessarily principal specificity, more time in the moderate bucket.
Mm-hmm. It was interesting, probably a really in between on a classic 5-zone model for cycling, endurance and tempo. I kind of came up in the education of, well, tempo, it's more fatiguing, but it's still aerobic. And now there's more people say, well, it's actually not really that aerobic because it starts to activate the glycolytic system more. And then you have, people, San Milan is saying, once you do that, it takes 20 minutes to come back down to becoming aerobic. And there's other guys like Andy Coggin in this other podcast who's saying that's crazy. That's how we ride a bike. That's not true. Do you have any opinion on when someone's going out for an 80 ride, if they dip their toe in the 20, how bad is that? Or how much does that throw things off?
Yeah. So, just as a matter of like my basic philosophical orientation, I am more of like a big picture person, and I am wary of looking at physiology or anything else training related like too microscopically. You can tell, like a really sort of persuasive just so story about, what's going on, at a cellular level in your body. It's just like, see, you can see right here, the microscope shows us this is dangerous. And then you actually do an outcome-based study to look at, well, what is actually the consequence? And there's no consequence, So like I see, some people who describe this, I'm very analytical. Well, actually, you just have no capacity to see. It's like losing the forest for the trees. And to me, like I look at the best coaches out there, and they tend to be in neuroscience, they have a term called coarse graining, which is like it's just that when it's basically the way our consciousness works, and it's the only way our consciousness could possibly work. It's like if your brain was constantly aware of all of the afferent feedback coming from your body simultaneously, your mind would explode, because like it would just be such incredible data overload. So the consciousness that you and I are experiencing right now is just a very, very high level summary of everything that sort of lies underneath. And it's the only way you can sort of like be decisive. It's like, okay, well, here's the main thing going on here. I'm starving. I'm going to get a sandwich. And I think coaching needs to sort of work the same way. Like, it sounds almost like an endorsement of laziness or inattention, but I just don't think it's that. I I see mistakes made more often with people who lose the forest for the trees than the folks who just sort of try to keep everything in view simultaneously and be decisive.
That's, yeah, I like to hear that because I've had coming up from more of a rudimentary go ride your bike, keep it pretty simple, then worked with some other people which were much more specific, and I learned a lot, but it did, even as the athlete, I don't want to say it became less fun, but it became every little thing seemed to matter. But then there's never a stepping back. And that also I don't think is sustainable to, and there was Adam Mills as a coach out west, and we were chatting after a podcast, and we had this came up, and I was saying something like, well, what about like if you're riding too much of this and you become more glycolytic? He's like, yeah, but at the end of the day, it's the performance. Like, how is it helping the athlete? You can't just always harp on the physiological side of things. And it was a really good reminder for me because I can definitely get sucked down that wormhole because you hear somebody else talking about this and talking about that. And at the end of the day, I do think sometimes it muddies the water. The science is obviously really, really important, but it has to be looked at with the athlete and them performing. So, yeah, it's interesting. In the book, you talk about motivation, and how motivated do you think athletes should be for their hard, or we call the 20 session? When do they need to just push through? Because sometimes you might wake up. Today was a great example for me. I had a weird night's sleep. I'm usually a deep sleeper. I did not feel great this morning. I said, what? I'm going to do the first effort. And if it's total crap, I'll bail on it. But if it's good, I'm just going to go. And I couldn't, it ended up being a great workout.
Yeah.
But had I just gone by these feelings, I definitely would not have done it. And I would have shifted things. And I think sometimes athletes, then they keep pushing and pushing it off. How do you coach someone with that? How do they know? Because they're not probably calling you every morning. What's the teaching? How should we use our motivation with specific workouts?
Yeah. I love that question. I think for the most part, training needs to have a rhythm to it. And because with rhythm comes predictability, and predictability is it's athlete friendly, so athletes know, today's gonna be a day where I can just daydream through my session, and then tomorrow's gonna be a day when I'm gonna have to do a gut check. And so when you sort of when it basically follows the same pattern from microcycle to microcycle, it sets athletes up to just sort of align their motivation around it. But obviously, it's not going to be perfect. That's half the battle, and then there's still going to be some misalignment at times. When it's Thursday, and every Thursday we do intervals, and you're just not feeling it this Thursday. For me, I think the default should be for athletes that you suck it up and you do it, because that's the sport. So if race day is Saturday and you're just not feeling it Saturday morning, you're not going to go to the race director and say, hey, we're calling this thing off because I'm just not feeling it. So athletes have to practice sucking it up and working hard even when they'd rather not. If there's nothing physically wrong with you, that should be the default. Having said that, so my mom was a family therapist, and so she was really tuned into psychology when I was growing up, and sometimes how kids will pretend to be sick occasionally to get out of going to school when they're just not feeling it. Well, my mom gave me and my brothers permission to take mental health days every now and then. So that was a perfectly legitimate excuse not to go to school, as long as we didn't abuse it. But she would rather have us just say, Mom, I don't want to go to school today, than to have us fake, an illness and take us to the doctor unnecessarily. And I think athletes should have the same permission. There's a time for the stick, and there's a time for the carrot, where you just have to give yourself a break and give yourself some grace every now and then as an athlete. In your heart if you're mentally tough or not, and that's not going to change. If you are, that doesn't change because you give yourself, one mental health day off from a hard workout.
This is a really good clip that I will be pointing some athletes to, because that is one thing that I do enjoy workouts, but I do ride a lot. So I get a lot of endurance time that allows me to do that daydreaming. But with some athletes, I'm not always sure when to give them the free ride or just go. Cause then some people are like, hey man, I feel like you're not like, I want to work out. That's what I'm here for. I'm like, yeah, but this is important for longevity. And you just did, 2.5 weeks or whatever you did. But again, it's my best educated guess. And so sometimes I might put a workout slash or free ride. And then some people don't like interpreting that. It's like, this will just be a good clip to explain to people, like, this is why there is that option. And it's important to have that freedom. And really, I'm going to blank on his name, from USA Cycling. He had said before, the athlete is the CEO. And he goes, I'm just here as a consultant to them. And I've used that to other athletes before to help them try to take ownership of the training, whether it's big picture, as we were talking before, or going on the micro and the day to day. So that's good to hear. What do you think? And I'm actually curious for like runners or cyclists, and I think you might coach triathletes also, strength training. Yes, no, who yes, who no? Where do you fall with that?
I'm a huge fan of strength training. And there are those people who come to endurance from a strength background, and they oversell strength training. Like that's a thing. It's that.
Meaning they put too much priority on it?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
Or,
I haven't.
and they,
Interesting.
just like the expression, if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. It's just like a lot of people, they've only got one solution to any problem. And but for me, I don't come from a strength background, but I always enjoyed being in the gym, and I saw the benefit, just clearly beneficial. And so, and I'm not an expert, but the people I consider, the most legitimate experts, are big fans of, it's, I mean, I get it. There are, like, if you go to, like, look at some of the top runners from East Africa, where it's like there's not a lot of access to high quality gym equipment. Like, people don't grow up doing that, and like some of these athletes, they become world beaters, without doing much. But then again, they have a pretty physical lifestyle. I'm reading a book about Patrick Sang right now, the coach of Eliud Kipchoge, the world record holder in the marathon, and just talking about the lifestyle there. So they're kind of lifting just by living. But for us, I think we do need to kind of go out of our way to make it part of our overall training formula. The good news is that, and the research is clear on this, like, any amount is better than none at all. So, like, if you're time crunched, or if it's just not your thing, going from 0 to a little bit is going to be beneficial. And then if you're like, hey, I don't care, I'll do whatever it takes to be the best athlete I can be. Okay, well, then you can start doing it the way the pros do, which is like, it's actually pretty high volume, for a lot of elite endurance athletes, and also super specific. They're not going in there and banging out, 10 reps of bench press. So that's the other thing. It's not like, it's less, it's the question of, like, do you or don't you, but it's also, once you've committed to doing it, how do you do it? Like, it's not CrossFit. It's not bodybuilding. It's functional, as they say.
Does that change during someone's like base phase and then moving into their race season? Would you still do your athletes find benefit from lifting while they're also racing?
Yeah, I mean, for sure, it has to be, your strength training has to be periodized in a way that keys off of your top priority, which is endurance training. Sometimes I'll occasionally coach an athlete who loves the gym, and we all love seeing progress. So I've had athletes who are like, "Coach, I just PR'd in the deadlift," and I'm like, "That's great, but you're not a power lifter." So it's like, it's maybe not all that great, actually. So everything is keying off. It's strength training is an ancillary modality for a cyclist or a runner or a triathlete. So, like, so that's the way it should work. It's almost like like a duet. Where the endurance training is singing melody, and the strength training is singing harmony, and sort of like fitting itself around. And it has to evolve. generally, I think a helpful way to think about it is like, um, when your endurance training load is the lightest, that's when your strength training load should be the heaviest. So off season, early base period, that's a good time to sort of like build a reserve of strength. And you actually should be losing strength when you are in the peak racing season, because you're deprioritizing. I mean, you can't be good at everything at once, right? So yeah, if you're PRing in the deadlift, like, a week out from an A race, like that's probably not good. And then there's some sports specificity. So your runners, for example, they will in their kind of peak race period, or when they're getting approaching an important race, they're going to be focusing more on plyometrics and less on like the heavy lifts and stuff, because running is jumping.
And I like that. Running is jumping. What about signs of fatigue or fitness? What are some things that kind of hit you that you see when coaching athletes, whether it's any of the metrics we talked about before or something from the athlete? What kind of signs do you look for those?
I mean, the number one for me is like, I like to have, I think, any athlete can sort of put the workouts they do, they can grade them experientially as either above average, average, or below average, right? Like you finish any ride and you're asked, hey, was that an above average? Just as an experience, like how you felt, how you performed, how you feel about how you performed. It's like above average, average, or below average. It's like it's so doable. Like it's never. I mean, you're never going to stump an athlete with that question. We might all have our different definitions of average, but you can rate your sessions, and for me, what I look for is just a change in the ratio. Most sessions should be average. It's impossible to have. Because I mean, it defies the definition of average. if every session is above average, so like the goal is not to have every session be above average, but you want to see some of those, because if that's not happening, then you're obviously not balancing stress and fatigue very well. Like that, periodic, really great workouts is a sure sign that you're on track. Most sessions should be in the average bucket. And then a few are unavoidably going to be in the below average category. That is like, and if that's not happening, you're not training hard enough, probably. But it's like when you see, and so you get a sense of what's normal for an athlete. And then when you see those below average sessions start to stack up, that's when you're flirting with danger.
You have just verbalized something that is such a big topic for someone newer to endurance sports that doesn't understand that the newbie gains do end at some point, but that every hard ride is not going to be a PR. And I'm not laughing at them, but I'm chuckling to myself looking back when someone, has set 10 PRs over the past 3 months and they're like, right. I'm sucking. And it's like, okay, wait a minute. How do I explain this to you? Like, you are kicking ass so this is really good. Average by definition, most should be average, and only having some of those be these breakout rides, runs, whatever it might be. That's huge. I was going to say maybe putting this in the mental skills bucket, but you had the last chapter of the book that was, I believe, titled, Is It Worth It? And talking about it's not the reward, it's the self-discovery, the value of what you're going to learn about yourself and what qualities do you find. I think that's the biggest thing that I'm in love with endurance sports, and just looking back and still trying to look forward and see what other things I can peel back about myself. But do you ask an athlete, like, I think it might have even says, like, what do you want to become? Or like, how do you if someone hasn't read your book and you start coaching them, like, that's just such a huge piece to this for them to find personal growth with their training, I guess I could say. Like, do you coach people on that, or how do you present this to them? Because I just thought it was such a good chapter. It meant a lot to me personally to read that, because I think any athlete has those questions. Like, there's days when it's like, what am I doing out here? And you can look back to, hey, like, what are you trying to find out about yourself? So that was me talking a lot about it, but it definitely hit me in a great way. How does that come into play with the people that you coach?
Yeah, endurance sports are fascinating in this way because, our limits are fundamentally psychological in nature. Like when an athlete, just feels they can't go any faster or can't go any farther, you can conduct every physiological test known to mankind, and they all say this athlete's fine. This athlete, like, nothing is broken. Like, they're close to a hard physiological limit. They're not at a hard physiological limit. And so psychological limits are every bit as real as physical ones. I mean, there are ways of scientifically or in a lab inducing pain that cause no damage, and everyone has a limit to what they'll tolerate, even though they're not even being physically hurt. It's the same thing with perceived effort. Like, so the limit is real, but it is different from a hard physiological limit. It's mutable, movable. So motivation is one of many factors that can actually. There's always sort of like there's a buffer between the physiological constraints that would ultimately limit you and the actual limit you encounter, which is psychological. There's always a buffer, and what you're trying to do as an athlete is compress that buffer, to get the psychological limit you actually run into to as close as possible to the immovable wall of your physiological limits. And motivation is critical for that. And motivation is very individual. It's like not everyone, because what you're doing is making a choice to suffer. You're making a choice to keep suffering and knowing that it's only going to get worse. And it is a choice. And when you quit, it is a choice. Nothing's broken. And so for me, I talk about this in the book, and it's part of the reason I'm so fascinated with it is when I was a high school runner, I was very aware that I was limited psychologically. Like I had these, I have these mental pictures still to this day, from the late 1980s when I would be like, sprinting toward the finish line, neck and neck with another runner, usually, somewhere between first and third place, and just being able to feel that the athlete next to me wanted it more than I did, and just sort of caving. I became, some coaches don't like this term, but I don't mind it. Like I became a classic head case. Like I just sort of ended up, burning out and quitting a sport I love because I just wasn't willing to suffer as much as I needed to be state champion. And so when I got back into, I took almost a decade off and got back into it in my late 20s. And when I did, I had a monkey on my back. Like it wasn't that wasn't only that I wanted to make up for lost time and become the runner I could have been. Yeah, that was important to me. Like I wanted to see how fast I could go, but more important than that was changing how I viewed myself as a man. Like I viewed high school runner Matt as a coward. I like just look, calling a spade. I was mentally weak. And so that became my motivation in sort of my, in act two of my life as an endurance athlete. And it worked. Like it took a long time because I was still the same person, but actually just making that a conscious commitment. It's like, I don't want to view myself as a coward anymore. Like that, that was powerfully motivating for me. And I would not let myself off the hook. If I finished a race and knew I gave a 95% effort, it didn't even matter if I PR'd or won. Like it was like, that was a failure. So it worked. Like I got to the point of, I used to be in high school. I would be just like, if I had a cross country meet on Saturday, in math class on Thursday, I would be a wreck. I would almost be throwing up my lunch. I was so nervous. And I got to a point, as an adult endurance athlete, when I remember standing on the starting line of my second Ironman triathlon, just feeling and just looking around, thinking, I am utterly calm. Like I'm looking ahead at 10 hours of pain and with a lot at stake. You know, I was trying to qualify for the world championship, and I had no butterflies at all. And it wasn't because I wasn't into it. Like I was excited. Like I was hungry. I'm like, let me at this thing. But like the fear was gone. And so that's what, and I had a great race, by the way. So like that is what sort of tapping into your deepest personal motivations can do. It's like, it sounds sort of woo woo maybe to some athletes who are all about, you know, the physiology, but like, that's how you get the most out of yourself, is like making it one step away from of life or death importance. It's like, who are you and what are you about?
I'm a huge fan of the woo woo. I think the mental side of things is just absolutely massive. And I think there's a part in the book too about failure. And I look back, I did not become a D1 basketball player. And at that point of my life in high school, I thought I just wasn't good enough. And then looking back, I realized I didn't do enough work. I wasn't in a weight room. And I look back, and when I was older, I was like, man, well, nobody told me to. It's like, well, you know, I should have been looking into it myself. I didn't look for the best resources. I didn't say to somebody, what else can I do to get better? I went to practice, and then I went home and I did schoolwork. And so I think finding endurance sports later in life, I've always remembered that. And it was so motivating as you go, you know, Cat 5, Cat 4, you start to upgrade and you go to these regional races and you see some of these guys, and I'm like, that dude is a cyclist. Like, what is that guy doing? And so that failure and disappointment has definitely motivated me more as an adult athlete and trying to, you know, continually find my motivation. I think just, yeah, that you guys got to read this book. I think there's just so many gems for people that it's going to take you to a next level without you having to pedal harder. It's going to help you look inside. And like you said, that might be foo-foo for some people, but damn, it works. When people buy into that type of stuff and understand themselves more, I think that's really when they find their best performance. So what, shifting towards a couple kind of miscellaneous things, what do you think about recovery and how athletes approach that? And what do you think are some of the most important things for them to be able to have the hard sessions being hard enough, so that they're recovering from all the other stuff they're doing, and maybe even life if it's, you know, an adult athlete that has a job and family and et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I think the thing that is often overlooked when, you know, the discussion turns to recovery is, you know, when that topic is introduced, people tend to think, you know, like massage or compression boots, or you know, drinking a smoothie after the workout, or you know, like, you know, checking my sleep quality with my aura in the morning. And yeah, it is all that, but like, we can't forget, you only need to recover if you have something to recover from. And by far the most powerful way to sort of optimize recovery is to balance your training appropriately. Like, you know, like, you know, the way I try to sort of make it intuitive to folks is I ask, okay, what is the hardest workout that you could do every day indefinitely without unraveling? And, you know, the answer to that question is, well, not really that hard. I mean, like, you know, you could only ride so long or so intensely before it's just not sustainable every day for the rest of your life. And like, okay, so what is the gap between that workout, the hardest workout you could do every day for the rest of your life without killing yourself, and the hardest workout you could possibly benefit from in a context where everything is set up to make you able to do that workout? And of course, the gap is tremendous. You know, like a well-trained, well-prepared, well-rested athlete can crush some truly epic workouts that are, you know, way beyond something they could do every day. So like, that's how I look at recovery is like, you know, it's actually, it's as much about the work as you're like, you're actually trying to, because, you know, recovery bleeds into adaptation. It's like adaptation is really just a continuation of recovery processes. So, and so the more you have to recover from, the more you're going to adapt, as long as that next really hard session doesn't come up too quickly. And so, Yeah, that has nothing to do with ice baths or red light
Uh,
therapy or whatever. But
I love that though. It goes back into the first thing of like seeing the big picture. It's all tied
Mhm.
together, and that's no, it's so perfect for the athlete that always has. They start feeling good, and then every workout is a smash fest. It's like, okay, you got that's not stop doing that. That's not the point of the really hard workouts. And just the last point that you said of you got to recover before you're going to do it again. So I think that's just really good big picture insights. What about nutrition questions that you might get or big things that come up? Maybe any tips for on the bike fueling that you see people maybe going awry, or we can take this a number of different ways, like specific types of strategies like carb restricted training or low fiber diets. Any of those come across from the runners? I know they're definitely topics in the cycling world, but what do you think about those?
Yeah, I guess the way I'm going to choose to answer this question is I'm reminded of are you familiar with Steven Seiler? He's
Yeah.
actually the guy who coined 80/20. So exercise physiologist, an American based out of Norway, and he came up with this cool thing, Seiler's hierarchy of endurance training needs, and it's a pyramid with different tiers, and it's based on actually Abraham Maslow's
Hmm.
hierarchy of basic human needs, which he came up with, a psychologist who came up with it back in the 40s or something. And so it's a ripoff, but it's an adaptation, and it's really cool. So like Seiler, who knows his stuff, he said based on all of the available evidence, like if an endurance athlete is doing absolutely everything wrong, or if they're not training at all, what is the lowest hanging fruit? Like what is the absolute top priority if you're going to go from doing nothing right to doing one thing right? And for him, at the base of the pyramid was like training a lot.
Hmm.
Like training a lot is like the most proven beneficial ingredient to becoming the best possible athlete you could be. You can do the same thing with nutrition, right? And I think that's sort of a healthy approach to it,
Hmm.
because what you mentioned things like carb restricted training. Well, guess what, folks? Like that's way up at the tippy top of the
Hmm.
pyramid, and for too many athletes who are doing all kinds of things wrong with their diet, they see methods like that as a bright shiny object, and they go running right past. So they're eating Snickers bars for lunch, and then doing carb restricted workouts. I'm like, something's wrong with this picture.
I love
So
it.
I recommend just like you know start with the absolute basic stuff. What is number one is just overall diet quality. Like
Hmm.
it's like how much processed food is in your diet. If it's a lot, it should be a little, and let's
Hmm.
work on that. And then it's not that you can't do more than one thing at the same time, but actually, making a lot of these changes isn't terribly easy. So it is helpful to prioritize them. It's like get the basics right, and then earn the right to do other stuff. And of course, if you have sort of an atrocious diet and you're doing long rides, yeah, you still want to fuel them. It's not like like you have to earn the right to fuel long rides, because that could be dangerous. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it's just a huge topic. So I just think orienting people in that way. It's like something like the the carb restricted training, like the benefit is probably there, but it's just minuscule compared to what you're going to get from doing more
Hmm.
basic things correctly.
That's awesome. I got two more for you. And this is the last one was a very big question. Sometimes I do a bad job of asking too many questions at once, but this is a wide open question. What is your number one tip for a newer athlete trying to get faster?
Number one is falling in love with the sport,
Mm.
and if you've already fallen in love, staying in love. That is a number one. And you recognize that there's that chapter on Ned Overend in How Bad You Want It. It's all about aging, and the effects of aging and performance, and like why do some so Ned Overend won he was a world champion mountain biker, and then he transitioned into off-road triathlon and won 2 world championships in off-road triathlon, age 43 and 44. And so like, but he's one guy, but there are other folks like him out there athletes who are like, another one is Abdi Rahman, a African-born American runner who qualified for 5 Olympics, the 5th one at age 43 in the marathon. And so it's like how do some athletes, how are they awesome forever? Like how do they defy father time? And if you study these athletes, you see it every single time without exception. They nurture the passion, they prioritize the passion, they put that ahead of everything. Like their attitude is basically like, the more fun I'm having, the more I'm enjoying this, everything else will take care of itself. And that's not exactly true, but it is a number one. Like, because you just the hungrier you are, like the more the sport is feeding you, the performance is going to come. And yeah, there's plenty you have to do right methodologically, but like, to answer, that is the answer to your question, is like, because you see it all the time. Athletes, I mean, anyone who, gets past their first race, they've basically had that sort of, they've got a strong crush on the sport. It's like, but over time, as athletes have a tendency to get more and more focused on outcomes, got to get better. The numbers got to be trending in the right direction. And then somewhere along the way, the passion dies. And you just don't want to make that mistake, because like, really, you don't have to choose one or the other. You actually have to have both. You can only perform at peak level if you're having the time of your life.
That's amazing. I love that. My last one for you, looking down the road, and maybe personally, but also as like the industry, what kind of excites you about the future of coaching, training, endurance sports? I'm
just such a curious person. There's a lot of ways I could go with that question, but I tell you what, this AI thing, artificial intelligence, is like a gigantic disruptor. This is one of those moments when, if you're a sentient human being, you have to step back and just marvel at our species. It's like, look what we can do. I mean, this is like first moon landing level, the power of this stuff. And there's some danger there. And experts in this stuff are, raising red flags. And there are a lot of endurance coaches who are scared out of their minds, because we look at, if we have any understanding of how AI works and what it can do, we're like, oh, we're first in line to be replaced by this stuff. But I'm just like, I'm not worried about being replaced. I'm just curious, because this isn't going anywhere, and it is going to deeply penetrate endurance sports. So I'm just sort of like interested to see how it plays out. And I also, as someone who, just has like very clear values in relation to sport, like I want to have an influence, because, ultimately it is humans made this, and humans in every industry, including endurance sports, have to decide how do we want to channel this so that, we don't have fire breathing robots, just wreck it.
There's a Lex Friedman podcast that one of the guys on there, he's had a bunch of AI people on, and he's going through all the things that we said we would not let AI do, and we're basically letting it do. And so it was a little frightening. I think the best analogy that I think, when AI, is just so far away from endurance sports, like it just can't get enough input to give an athlete the right output yet. But there was an AI program that went through these contracts for attorneys, and a real attorney did it, and the program did it. The program did it in like 37 minutes, and the real attorney did it, I think, in 3 hours. And the AI program did it better. They got the scores, and I said to the attorney, "How do you feel?" He said, "This is awesome." He goes, "If this thing can help me do the contract better and faster, that's not my whole job." He's like, "That's I have to use my brain, but that's also kind of like our busy work." if there is something that can actually go through and do progression of intervals and understand what has the athlete done and what workout should they do next, and even WKO, great program, they have optimized intervals, definitely not perfect and needs human interpretation, but if there was something that could make that better, and so all these pieces, if that could be something that could help me, I would love that. There's surely programs out there now that are just so far off it, and I do have athletes that use them, and we often break them, and they're like, the system does not like this, and we talk about like, why is it good, why would it be bad, what would so yeah, I think I'll be curious to see where it goes and how fast it comes, but hopefully it's going to be a great tool. And yeah, if it can take away really understand the athlete and workout selection, I would love to know what it would give myself. And so yeah, that's interesting. I was curious where you would go with that one. Man, this is awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this, Matt. It's been really insightful. So many great, more not even gems, but like mindsets or ways for people to think about their own training. And again, guys, I really highly recommend you get his book. I'll put a link into it in the show notes. Is there anything that I maybe missed, or any last words that you want to get across to people that follow you or people that might not know you? You've shared a ton of information. Maybe there's something else that you got there that you want to send off with.
I'll give a quick shout out to a new business venture I've just launched. It's called Dream Run Camp, and it's like a pro style training experience for athletes of all levels in Flagstaff, Arizona. So I actually recently moved to Flagstaff to start this thing. So it's like it's runner focused, but who knows?
How do people find that? Is it dreamruncamp.com?
It sure is. Yep.
Sweet. That sounds cool. I haven't been. There was a guy that I met. He was actually on the podcast who was riding out. I think it was in Flagstaff. I've never been to Arizona to ride, and it's definitely been on my list when it's like chilly and cold in the winter. But you're in North Carolina, aren't you?
No, I'm in Flagstaff.
Oh, now you are. You used to be in North Carolina.
No. Moved from California to
okay, I'm gonna have to find this website, because this website was like, Matt lives in North Carolina. I was like, oh no way, I'm in North Carolina. That's hilarious. All right. Well, on that note, Matt, thanks so much for doing this. Appreciate it, everybody. I'll post Instagrams and websites and check out what Matt's doing. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you. I had fun.
Me too.